From a pandemic in progress to social and political unrest, today's big risks are playing out in full view. But some Wall Street visionaries are thinking about what's coming tomorrow.
There's nothing that you can do to say that a system is free of the possibility of being hacked.
Longtime Goldman Sachs executive Marty Chavez worries about cybersecurity and warns that tech giants have become too big to fail. You've told me that you're more concerned about non-financial companies than you are about financial companies.
We can't have the companies generate these riches and then say to society, oh, there were some unfortunate side effects.
I'm not afraid that AI is going to ruin, the world.
Two Sigma's David Siegel sees both sides of the tech dilemma. On the plus side, there's growth and innovation. But on the other,
the measurement of the health of a society is a very hard problem. I just think that we have to all have a level of caution that makes sure that we don't go in a direction that is really not what we want.
What I'm really worried about is what I think is the next pandemic, which is the unskilled worker.
Eileen Murray is sounding the alarm on mass unemployment. The former co-CEO of Bridgewater says we ignore these trends at our peril.
This is the United States of America. We have the people to A, recognize this problem, and B, start working on it, because the last thing we want is systemic unemployment for an extended period of time.
Cyber risks in particular is something that financial executives have been warning about for some time. And given it's something that you're so concerned about right now too, do you think that the industry is adequately prepared for it?
There's nothing that you can do to say that a system is free of the possibility of being hacked. And so you can never rest on your accomplishments. And no matter how good a job you're doing, you should always be very worried. In the earlier versions of cybersecurity, they would say, we're going to defend our perimeter. We're going to have an extremely strong perimeter. And it's going to be very, very hard to get in. But if you were able to get in, it was like the Maginot Line, right? Or maybe you could just drive around it, right? Once you got in, then you're just in the squishy interior that isn't really protected at all. So that approach of having a very strong perimeter only takes you so far. And so here's what you do, Sonali. You then assume that all of your own computers are potentially hostile. You no longer assume that there's a safe perimeter of trust of your own computers. You assume they're hostile too.
You've told me that you're more concerned about non-financial companies than you are about financial companies. And so what is that concern? On one hand, I hear this great sense of trust in some of the tech companies, especially as it pertains to the cloud. But on the other hand, there are real risks as these firms get a lot bigger.
I'm thinking a lot about what the Federal Reserve created for and with the banks that led to the resiliency that the banks demonstrated during the pandemic. Well, it's requiring the banks to have reserves of capital and reserves of liquidity, more than would be optimal if you were planning for everything to work perfectly. Similarly, non-financial companies have evolved just-in-time supply chains. Everything is priced to perfection. We don't want to make or store too many cotton swabs or Pyrex glass pieces because that's just inventory, and that's bad for returns to tie up capital and inventory. So let's just make all the supply chains timed perfectly. That's risky.
So what you're talking about here, in fact, is a stress test on the big tech companies in some fashion.
Well, it's certainly my recommendation, and I'm not the only person with these kinds of recommendations. So as an example, so we talked a little bit about supply chain and logistics companies, digital businesses that get merchandise to their customers. And there's been an awful lot of discussion. Let's go to a different example of a social media business, right? So there, if you look at the core business model, the core business model has some challenges that remind me of the pre-regulated banks business model challenges, right? So, and it's nothing particular to these companies. It is just in the nature of untrammeled, unrestricted profit maximization. So if your business model is maximize profits, like every good capitalist enterprise, and if your model is we maximize profits by maximizing advertising revenue, because that's our only stream, and we maximize advertising revenue by maximizing engagement and time on site, and we maximize engagement and time on site by maximizing emotional resonance, particularly outrage, by confirming biases. I mean, as we've seen, this has led to all kinds of consequences that really are classic externalities, right? It's no different in principle from a company that's making some chemical product and just flushing its waste into a river. For the company, it's optimal.
I know you're a believer in technology fundamentally, but do you think, though, that the types of technology we are creating are no longer doing a service to society?
So, Sonali, they're doing a service to society. I'm 100% confident in that, just as the banks have always been doing a service to society. The question is the unintended systemic side effects. We can't have the companies generate these riches and then say to society, oh, there were some unfortunate side effects. We had all the benefits. The rest of the world had all the negative side effects. The companies themselves have to capitalize for those negative outcomes. It is doable.
When you look past the next 5 to 10 years, when you look at society, when you look at markets and the economy, what do you think is the biggest risk that's on the horizon?
I am quite concerned about the impact of the changing nature of work on overall the human experience. Let's call it the human experience.
Well, one of the things that you had said to me before was that you don't believe we're building a world meant for humans. What does that mean?
Well, that's what I mean by the human experience. We are supposed to be building a world that we like. Everything around us is for the purpose of us. We want to have an enjoyable life. We want to live in an environment that we find pleasant. We want to have rewarding careers. We want to have an education that is enlightening. There's all these wonderful things that we can create that will make our lives rewarding and enjoyable. But that will only happen if that's exactly what we're focusing on doing. I think that the opportunities are enormous. And I am not one of these people that I'm not afraid that AI is going to ruin the world. I don't think that we are on a path that is terribly regrettable. I'm quite the opposite. I'm extremely optimistic. I just think that we have to all have a level of caution that makes sure that we don't go in a direction that is really not what we want.
If you were advising a government official or a technologist here, what are some of the things that could be creating a society that is more meant for humans?
Well, look, I think it really does have to start with having better metrics for trying to gauge, are we happy with our society? GDP, for example, is often the metric that people focus on. And if GDP is going up, then a lot of people would conclude that we're doing a great job. But I think that GDP is an overly simple measure. It's just one number. Quality of life is not necessarily measured by, in fact, is not exactly correlated with GDP. It's really quite a different story. In addition, GDP isn't measuring, how the rewards are actually divvied up. You might have very inequitable growth. And so, at the very least, I think everyone can agree that as society evolves into something much more influenced by technology, the benefits really have to go to a broad range of people. It can't just go to, a very small minority of the population.
Do you have any suggestions on new ways to start measuring the success of our society?
Well, it turns out that how society is doing, just like how a business is doing, is very hard to capture in one number. Ultimately, There are a lot of different things that you would actually need to measure to get a picture, a snapshot of how we're doing. Things concerning health, things concerning even, a lot of people don't like to become so touchy-feely, but just measurements of happiness and satisfaction. We need to also measure how much, how fairly things are being divided up among people. So the short answer here is that the measurement of the health of a society is a very hard problem. And because it's a hard problem, people have tried to oversimplify it down to one or two numbers, which I think is quite inappropriate.
What I'm really worried about is what I think is the next pandemic, which is the unskilled worker. Basically, advanced economies have really grown very rapidly over the last 20 years, but jobs haven't. And so I look at that and I look ahead over the next, call it 5, 10, 15 years, and it really worries me that we're not reskilling people, we're not reskilling employees. And some places like the World Economic Forum will say governments need to get more involved in this. I agree. But I think it has to be a combination of government and business that really takes this on board, as well as education, much the same way as the horrific pandemic we're living through right now required a lot of smart people to get together to get the vaccine, think about distribution, to think about supply chains. This unskilled worker is the next pandemic that's coming. And unfortunately, Sonali, as you know, it's not going to be solved by a 12 to 18 month study on vaccines or more security and with respect to something like a 9/11. So I really do believe, we need to get on this. And my goal is to get people to really recognize this is a problem, which I'm hearing more and more about, which I think is great with these studies. And then let's start doing something about it. So I'll stop right there.
Yeah, well, I want to also draw out what the risk is if this problem does not start to get solved. The unskilled worker losing jobs, right? I mean, you're talking about the potential for significant unemployment if we don't start to fix this problem.
I think there's significant unemployment, and absolutely. And let's step back, into the 1930s when we had the Great Depression, and look at the lack of hope people had. The increase in drug use, the increase in alcoholism, the decrease in people becoming educated, and that sense of hopelessness that even when people came out of the Depression, for the rest of their lives they held those psychological wounds within them. And if we can avoid that, my gosh, this is the United States of America. Like we have the people to A, recognize this problem, and B, start working on it, because the last thing we want is systemic unemployment for an extended period of time. It'll result in an increase in taxes and so on and so forth.
Well, some of the job losses that had come from this pandemic was because of business closures. We're seeing an elevated unemployment rate. But for many years, this thing that you had mentioned has been happening, that technology is displacing workers as well. We've also seen a huge jump in the use of technology and technology platforms booming through this pandemic. This issue that you're talking about, this displacement of the workforce, do you think the pandemic has somehow accelerated this issue?
I don't think the pandemic has accelerated the issue. It's been coming because there are some businesses that will go out, but there are other businesses that will grow as a result of the pandemic. I think that really the problem here is looking at how are we retraining and reskilling people mid-career and early in their career. And if we don't do that, what's going to happen to those people in terms of being displaced? I think COVID, the government has given a huge stimulus package to help people, in terms of, putting food on the table, but it hasn't helped them retool and reskill. And I'd say that first. But I think this has been coming for a long time. And just like this pandemic, there are some people that knew it well before March. We know this is coming, so let's talk about it and get the right people involved to mitigate it and avoid it.